There I was, innocently scrolling through my Twitter feed, when all of a sudden I happen across an academic who is doing a class on tabletop games later in the year. And that might as well be the grim signal as far as things online are concerned. He's asking for help and advice and feedback on this course syllabus that he's put together. So I'm thinking, yeah, I'm a game designer, I've been in the industry for many, many years, I know it inside and out, I know a lot about game design, I know a lot about game design theory, and so on. I seem like a good person to weigh in. So I click on the link, and I read. It was bad. I tried to give some advice as best I could, but it's like me and this guy were speaking entirely different languages, and he couldn't really pass what I was saying or suggesting. Hopefully I've had some positive influence or introduced some other points of view that he might incorporate into the course, but we'll have to see. But yeah, it was just bad. So the aim of it was supposedly to prototype a tabletop game informed by a literary or cultural movement, a wooga, to determine how tabletop design is entwined with literature and new media today, a wooga, second red flag, and 3, learn digital studies methods through low-tech techniques that foreground speculation, culture, and aesthetics. Well, that's pretty much just a kind of empty noise so far as the rest of it's concerned. But those first couple of things, yeah. Problematic, I guess, is a word one could use in such an instance. The whole thing goes off the rails right from the get-go. I mean, step 1, week 1, they're supposed to read Anna Anthropy's Rise of the Video Game Zinesters. So, who the fuck is Anna Anthropy? I'm really struggling not to be mean here, because anything nasty I say will be taken as transphobic or whatever, because Anna Anthropy is a low-effort trans woman. That's the nicest way I suppose I can put it. They're involved in video games, but they're really only paid attention to in video games because they're trans. That's really it. They've made a handful of irrelevant non-games, essentially. I mean, points for not referencing Zoe Quinn, but Anna Anthropy is not relevant. And that's in video games. When it comes to tabletop games, Anna Anthropy is fucking nothing. They are nobody. They don't know or appear to know anything about it whatsoever. It's not like there isn't a thriving, pretentious propagandist movement within tabletop games as well. I mean, you could have chosen someone more relevant, like Professor Batdong and his GNS theory or whatever. You could have found someone else. You could have found other resources to point people to than Anna Anthropy. I mean, she's virtually irrelevant in computer games and utterly irrelevant in tabletop games. So why Anna Anthropy? It makes no sense, and these other references don't really make any sense either. Look, tabletop game design is not the same as computer game design, really. Anyway, yeah, even with these new open world games and multi-path games like Deus Ex, where you can find multiple solutions, you're still hemmed in. And when you're creating a computer game, you're telling a singular story, even though someone might weave their way through it in various ways. When it comes to tabletop games, you're not telling a story unless you're writing a specific scenario or a one-shot game, which is rare and not really found that often, and supplements don't really sell that well, and they still have to try and account for people doing things their own way. But when you're writing a tabletop game, a tabletop RPG, what you're really doing is creating a context in which people tell their own stories, over which you have near to no control whatsoever. So you've got a multi-layered problem here in that literary and film and other critical analysis just doesn't fucking apply to games, interactive media anyway, as Buxom Brainbox Liana Kersner has often pointed out. But whatever tools you've got for looking at computer games are barely going to be relevant to tabletop games anyway. So the entire foundation of this course, even from purely game design perspective, is fucked.
Let's fuck! I'll fuck anything that moves!
If anything, it gets even worse from there. The students are explicitly asked to select an ism for them to base their work going forward on. So, like, feminism, obviously, and similar. And to pick a text to do with that to base everything on. So it's explicitly from the get-go asking them to propagandize, to filter, to design from an explicitly biased and propagandist perspective. And this is profoundly unhelpful when you're creating games. I mean, creating propaganda is one thing, creating a game is another. And explicitly forcing some kind of message on someone is very different to having a design implicitly informed by your point of view, which still leaves room open for people to interpret and play in their own way, which is an essential part of role-playing games. This contextual thing that I'm talking about, you creating a world rather than a story. Fortunately, they're asked to play some games, so there's an opportunity for some different ideas to get in there. But again, it's still constantly trying to force it into old media perspectives, into critical analysis and old media, and so on. And these forms of analysis simply will not work and will not successfully inform anything that you do in this way as a game. It's not going to help. It's not going to work. I mean, this is part of the reason during Gamergate we wanted to set up a journal for studying game design from a non-rarefied, non-pretentious, non-propagandist, non-biased perspective. It founded because there's just no interest. And why is there no interest? Because of courses like this, because of papers and writings and so on like this, that are completely irrelevant to the experience of the overwhelming majority of game designers and virtually all players. These kinds of studies, these kinds of courses, they have nothing to say that's remotely useful to pretty much anybody involved in game design outside of these tiny, pretentious, irrelevant circle jerks. It's just really disappointing. I mean, courses like this for a lot of people might be the first place that they encounter tabletop games, and if it's going to be encountered through this kind of deliberate lensing, it may well put a lot of people off or introduce people into game design who are going to essentially have no idea how to make a game, but plenty of idea how to produce propaganda, whose idea of a good game design is to force their point of view onto someone at gunpoint, rather than just allowing it to implicitly inform what they do and create the world. It's just... So then they're supposed to make it an interactive fiction, which I don't particularly see the relevance there. I guess that choose your own adventure and tabletop games share a certain degree of heritage, but it just seems like an unnecessary step, really. And then they're supposed to make it into a tabletop game. But again, it's just all tangled up in this nonsense. Yeah, and then a set of rules, a board game, tokens, avatar. These are all things that aren't necessarily key or proper to a game, to a role-playing game, which usually takes place in theatre of the mind. and none of it's really that relevant. What they should be doing, if you want to actually learn about game design, is how to convey a world through descriptive, like, travelogue writing. This is something that's almost unique to tabletop RPGs, in that you describe a world and convey an impression and a feeling, both at the local level. You enter a 10 by 10 room, an orc is guarding a chest, or a much larger scale, like the Kingdom of Angela is a constitutional monarchy characterized by rolling green fields and relatively peaceful negotiations with its neighbours, or whatever. Conveying that kind of thing, that isn't something that usually happens directly in fiction, though a lot of exposition does tend to happen in science fiction and fantasy fiction. But it's a skill that's fairly unique to writing role-playing games, as is conveying rules. Like, roll 2 6-sided dice, add your skill, and beat the target number in order to succeed. Conveying rules is another skill that's appropriate, but this doesn't really spend very much time focusing on the actual skills of world building or rules design or whatever. And it would have been interesting to compare and contrast, say, the dungeon world, the apocalypse world engine sort of indie approach to the OSR indie approach, because D&D is something that, even through computer games, the kind of statistics and so on, these are things that form a common language of games, and the OSR is an indie scene that's very different to the story games indie scene. And to study both and compare and contrast, to fiddle with mechanics and see how they turn out differently in play, such as a bell curve versus a flat probability line, these are things that would actually be useful to people. But this course is not about any of that. It conveys nothing useful to game design. It focuses on old media approaches, critical theory. It's explicitly propagandist. It's like anti-teaching. It's not showing you anything useful. It's deliberately introducing bias and essentially fucking up a class of kids who might be future game designers. And it references irrelevancies and papers that will tell you nothing about tabletop design. Not that there's a lot of research material out there on tabletop design. We need better, and if I can't talk to these people and get through to them what the problem is, being polite, maybe I can get through by being a bit more strident and nasty. What you're doing is not teaching games. The critical theory and so on that you're trying to teach is inapplicable to interactive games anyway, and particularly inapplicable to tabletop games. What are you doing, and why? Why? Zang.
This isn't my world. Disappointed!
Postmortem Studios is my personal imprint, where I create role-playing games, stories, card games, board games, and more. You can get them at RPG Now, DriveThruRPG, Lulu.com, and some on Amazon. Role-playing games to die for.
I'm an urban animal, one step from a cannibal.